across medieval Islamic cities, Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo. You'll find a paper trail that doesn't line up neatly, love poems to beautiful boys, jokes that wink at forbidden nights, and legal texts that threaten hard punishments for the same desires. Court poets praised male beauty without blinking. Sufi verses wrapped longing for a boy in the language of the divine. Bathhouses and gardens show up in stories as meeting places. At the same time, jurists wrote rulings against liwat, and moralists railed from the pulpit. Some rulers had favorites everyone noticed. Scribes changed the subject. Which picture is true, the poems or the punishments, maybe both? This isn't a straight line. It shifts by city, by century, by rank, tolerated in whispers, condemned on paper, remembered in verse. Comment the exact time you're watching Dawn, Midnight, or in between. If this opened a new side of the past for you, tap like so the story travels farther. They say every courtyard in the medieval Islamic world had ears and eyes, and the kind of silence that listens harder than it should. You wake in one of them tiles, cool beneath your bare feet, the splash of a fountain, echoing like whispered laughter. The air smells faintly of jasmine and roasted coffee. Somewhere behind a mashrabiyah screen, a lute hums, and two young men recite poetry that flirts dangerously close to confession. You don't hear a declaration, you hear a dance. Because in this world, affection has choreography, an eyebrow raised in a bathhouse, a hand paused too long over a calligraphy brush, a sigh that's technically about the moon, but clearly about someone in the room. You quickly learn that people here have turned discretion into art. Love doesn't hide under a blanket, it hides in plain sight, wrapped in metaphor and rhyme. Baghdad, 10th century. The city is a map of murmurs. Caliphs walk marbled halls. Scholars debate divine law, and poets write verses about lips like pomegranates and cheeks like dawn. You'd think that's just flowery language until you notice how often the beloved in those poems is a boy with curls like coiled ink. You blink. Wait, was that allowed? That's the trick. It was, and it wasn't. You see, the Quran condemns lustful acts between men. But poetry lives in a different jurisdiction, one ruled by rhythm and ambiguity. Poets could claim they were describing divine love or the beauty of youth in general. It was like saying, I'm not in love with him. I'm in love with God's artistry. Convenient, right? One of those poets, Abu Nuwas, turns up like an uninvited guest at every scandalous party in early Abbasid Baghdad. He wrote openly about wine taverns and beautiful boys, and somehow managed to keep his head most of the time. You imagine him lounging by a fountain, ink-stained fingers twirling a grape, laughing at his own audacity. If God didn't want beauty admired, he might have said, why make it so symmetrical? You pass through the streets and see how people navigate the tension. Public morality is guarded by jurists and imams. Private life is an entirely different chessboard. Households include male servants, young apprentices, singers, people living in close quarters, sometimes for years. You sense the friction of human proximity. No one writes it down plainly, but it hums between the lines of letters, the pauses in prayer, the way one person adjusts another's turban a little too carefully. In places like Cordoba or Damascus, the culture of refinement, adab, encouraged sensitivity, beauty poetry, even softness in men. A perfect gentleman was supposed to appreciate music, scent, and verse. So admiring male beauty wasn't inherently suspicious. Only when admiration lingered too long did eyebrows rise. It's the kind of social rule you might recognize today. Flirt all you want, just don't make anyone have to talk about it. You lean against a stucco wall watching as a young calligrapher mixes ink, his mentor leaning in close to correct a curve. Their shadows on the wall merge into one shape. Somewhere nearby, a muezzin calls for prayer, and everyone straightens their robes. But the air still trembles from something wordless. Were they sinners or simply humans, with more honesty than their era could handle? That question follows you like a stray cat through the alleys. You notice that despite the restrictions, art flourished precisely because of the boundaries. It's amazing what creativity grows out of forbidden soil. When speech must disguise itself, language becomes luxurious. Think of it this way: in a time when printing presses didn't exist and stories traveled by voice metaphors were both mask and memory, the lovers who couldn't be named still found ways to live forever in ghazals and lantern-lit music, in the fragrance of ink on palm leaves. You wander deeper into the city, stepping past spice stalls and silk merchants, feeling how the marketplace itself hums with sensuality. Men compliment each other's robes, voices soft as perfume. You wonder if compliments were a form of camouflage. Perhaps your embroidery is exquisite, was. Secretly, I've been thinking about you since morning prayers. You might smile at how universal it all feels. The need to hide the thrill of being seen. It's no different from the coded glances in a modern office or the secret emojis in a chat you never name. Only here the stakes are higher, and every word could tilt between salvation and scandal. As the evening call to prayer rolls across domes and rooftops, you notice how the city changes color. The marble glows gold, the shadows stretch like silk. The same poets who risked everything with a metaphor now stand shoulder to shoulder in prayer eyes, lowered lips murmuring the same verses everyone else recites. But beneath those verses, you sense another kind of prayer, one that asks silently, is love still love if it must hide? Morning drips into the courtyard like honey, slow and golden, and you find yourself tracing the patterns of verse carved on the walls. Arabic script curls and unfurls like smoke, each letter both sound and secret. You soon realize that, in this world, poetry isn't just decoration. It's confession disguised as devotion. The poets of medieval Islam built entire labyrinths of metaphor to talk about desire. They didn't whisper, "I love him." They wrote, "His eyes are the wine that makes sense stumble." You see, it's not about deceit, it's about survival through beauty. Poetry was a passport, one that let dangerous feelings travel safely under the name of art. You pause under a fig tree reading lines by Al-Mutanabbi, Ibn Arabi, or Rumi, and notice a strange paradox. The same culture that officially condemned same-sex acts celebrated male beauty obsessively. Young men gulams appear in verse like celestial beings' faces compared to moons, cheeks to roses, and their presence in literature was as common as sunsets. Take, for instance, the Persian ghazal tradition. The beloved is often ambiguous, sometimes male, sometimes divine, sometimes both. The poet Hafez might praise a boy's curls as if they were a divine labyrinth where reason gets lost. When he says, "I have seen the face of God in a tavern boy," you can't tell whether to blush or kneel. It's easy to forget that for centuries, this coded language wasn't niche, it was mainstream. Scholars, rulers, merchants, all memorized verses where male beauty shone as a symbol of perfection. Imagine reading a state-sanctioned love poem today and realizing halfway through that it's not about a woman, it's about your male scribe. That's how open the subtext once was. You wander through a book market in Nishapur parchment stacked like loaves of bread, and a seller winks as he hands you a scroll. Inside, the verses are scandalous, but delicately so. There's nothing obscene, only longing so refined it sounds holy. You can almost hear the poet sighing. If heaven is pure, why does my heart crave something so human? Some of these poets found protection in ambiguity. Others didn't bother hiding much. Abu Nuwas again makes his cameo writing about smooth-cheeked boys and wine that makes wisdom forget itself. His poems were banned, recopied, then celebrated again centuries later. You might call him reckless, but his boldness forced the culture to look at its reflection. Think about how complex that reflection was. Islam's golden age produced both strict moralists and mystical dreamers. A jurist might condemn what a poet praised, and both could dine at the same table. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was the eternal human conflict between doctrine and desire, between what we believe and what our pulse insists on. You find this tension even in the mosques. Quranic recitation itself carried a musicality that blurred devotion with sensual experience. Sufi poets leaned into that blur, suggesting that beauty, any beauty, could be a gateway to the divine. If the beloved's face makes me remember God, one mystic said, then is my gaze truly sinful. As you stroll, you hear a group of scholars debating whether love itself can be sinful. One insists that beauty is a test of faith. Another argues that it's proof of God's generosity. The third, older and quieter, says, if your heart moves, it's already halfway prayer. You smile at that. It sounds like something a modern therapist would charge for. And yet for every poem that soared toward metaphor, there were ordinary people living the literal version, servants, musicians, scribes whose feelings didn't fit into polite verse. For them, poetry wasn't escape, it was mirror. You can picture a young apprentice copying lines about a moon-faced youth, realizing with a jolt that he's the moon in someone's stanza. Even love's vocabulary evolved to dodge accusation. Words like ishq, passionate love, and shock, yearning appeared in mystical treatises but bled into romantic ones. Over time, Sufi mysticism and poetic romance merged so tightly that separating them would be like trying to split scent from rose petals. You think of today's coded languages, slang symbols, private jokes, and public posts, and realize human ingenuity hasn't changed. When speech is risky, creativity blooms. What hashtags do now, calligraphy did then. By dusk, you find yourself in a small tea shop beside a bookbinder. The walls are lined with verses painted in gold leaf. The shopkeeper notices your curiosity and chuckles. We speak what we can, he says, and write what we cannot. He taps his heart, then the page. Paper is safer. Outside, the call to prayer stretches over the rooftops, again, rhythmic and tender. You notice that even the muezzin's voice carries the same music you heard in the poet's lines. A tremor of longing that could belong to anyone, for anyone. Maybe the real secret isn't who they loved, but how deeply they learned to hide it in beauty. You find yourself now beneath a low dome, cool and echoing, where oil lamps sputter over parchment and quiet arguments. This is a madrasa, part school, part library, part battlefield of ideas. The smell of ink is sharp. The sound of quills scratching is constant. You've wandered into a centuries-long conversation about love-sin, and the body carried out by men who could quote scripture faster than you can finish a cup of tea. A scholar in a white turban looks up from a manuscript. He's writing commentary on the hadith, his brow furrowed in concentration. Beside him sits another, eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and caution. They're debating what exactly the Quran means when it condemns the people of Lot. Is it the act, the intent, the imbalance of power, or is it, as some argue, a warning against lust without love? The room hums with tension, the kind that only words can create. You pull up a stool and listen. Each scholar has a different line to defend. One insists all same-sex desire is a corruption, citing verses with the precision of a lawyer. Another quietly points out that attraction itself isn't a choice, and that moral judgment should rest on action, not inclination. They argue like philosophers, not preachers, and you realize that even then, faith was full of debate, not decree. The great theologian Al-Ghazali once wrote that love can elevate or destroy depending on its purpose. To him, beauty was a reflection of God's perfection. Admiration for beauty could be holy if it reminded one of the Creator. But he also warned that obsession with form could pull a soul downward. Between divine remembrance and desire, he said, runs a thread thinner than a hair. You lean back, hearing echoes of the same tension that fills modern ethics debates. Isn't that the same question people ask today? Where does love end and sin begin? The scholars you're watching are centuries old, but they sound startlingly modern, cautious, curious, endlessly human. At another table, a student copies Ibn Hazm's The Ring of the Dove, that strange Andalusian masterpiece on the psychology of love. Ibn Hazm dissected affection like a scientist, the first glance the pulse of recognition, the ache of separation. His treatise didn't specify gender. It assumed love was universal, an affliction that struck without permission. You could almost imagine him nodding in sympathy to anyone who's ever fallen for the wrong person. The more you listen, the more you sense a pattern. Theologians sought clarity, but poets thrived in ambiguity. Law wanted definitions. Life refused to supply them. There were treatises on hudud, punishments prescribed for forbidden acts, but few actual prosecutions. Most judges preferred not to know. The unspoken rule was simple: don't bring your private heart to the public court. And yet, there were exceptions. Chronicles mention men accused, tried, or exiled not for what they did, but for being too visible, too careless with affection or words. The chronicler Ibn al-Jawzi once recorded that in Baghdad, even a whiff of scandal could end a career. But the same city, the same century produced love poems between scholars and their students that everyone read, and no one destroyed. You realize something subtle here. Hypocrisy wasn't the engine of this world. Complexity was. People lived inside contradictions, and they did it with surprising grace. The jurist who condemned sin might still quote poetry about beauty. The mystic who preached divine love might blush at the sight of a handsome acolyte. The tension didn't cancel faith, it gave it texture. Someone hands you a cup of tea, steam curling like calligraphy in the air. The student beside you murmurs, knowledge and desire are both forms of hunger. We fear the one that reminds us of the other. You almost laugh. He's right. You've met enough people, past and present, to know that intellect often hides the most restless heart. It's tempting to see these scholars as cold moralists, but their writings reveal something warmer, a wish to reconcile the human with the holy. They knew the heart doesn't follow logic, so they tried to map it anyway. You might picture them as medieval psychologists, tracing how affection forms, how longing evolves, how shame twists it into silence. As you leave the madrasa, the debate still rings in your ears as the balance between feeling and faith. Outside, the night breeze carries the smell of sandalwood from a nearby scriptorium. Somewhere another scholar leans over parchment, adding his own footnote to the endless commentary. He writes, "The heart is a mirror. What you see in it depends on what light you hold." You pause. It's not law. It's not poetry. It's something between. And maybe that's what all of this really was, a civilization trying to fit the messy tenderness of being human into the neat geometry of divine order. You hear shouting before you see color, then suddenly the market opens around you like a kaleidoscope. Step right up. Musk from Yemen, silk from China, coal for eyes that kill. Welcome to the bazaar, the loudest heartbeat of the medieval Islamic world, and maybe the most dangerous stage for desire. You weave through alleys smelling of cardamom and sweat, each turn flashing with copper trays, embroidered slippers, and eyes, so many eyes. Merchants, porters, apprentices, travelers from lands you can't even name. The air hums with barter and poetry, and you realize this is where beauty itself becomes currency. Hooked good. Because if the court poets hid affection behind metaphors, the bazaar hid it behind transactions. Compliments flew faster than coins. Your hands are steady as angels, a calligrapher tells his pupil. Your curls shame the prophet Joseph, murmurs a perfumer to a young courier. And yet no one flinches. It's all part of the game. In this world, praising beauty isn't suspicious, it's manners. The Arabic concept of adab demanded refinement, how to speak, how to admire, how to control yourself, even when your pulse betrays you. So when you hear men calling one another moon-faced or gazelle-eyed, it isn't scandal, it's style. Until it isn't. Somewhere behind a stall draped with indigo cloth, a young lute player tunes his instrument. His audience is mostly men traders, poets, and soldiers off duty. His song glides between devotion and flirtation, and the crowd knows better than to ask which it is. Music, after all, is its own disguise. In cities like Cairo and Aleppo, beauty was labor. Gilman young attendants served wine at private gatherings, poured coffee, recited verse. Some were servants, others entertainers. They were praised in poems and condemned in sermons. Yet everyone agreed their grace was unmatched. The Persian traveler Nasir-i-Khusrau once wrote that even the angels might envy their faces. You suspect he meant it literally. You stop by a mirror merchant stall and catch your reflection beside a cluster of youths trying on coal. Their laughter is light, their glances quick. You think about how attraction here survives, not in words, but in gestures, the brush of fabric, the echo of laughter, a verse recited just loud enough. A gray-bearded man selling rosewater notices your gaze and says softly, "The market teaches you what desire looks like when it wears perfume instead of guilt." He smiles like someone who's seen too much. Still, the danger never sleeps. There were stories always whispered of officials punished for keeping too handsome an entourage, or poets exiled for verses that named names. The chronicler al-Makrizi wrote of men executed not for proof of sin, but for embarrassing the wrong patron. You realize then love was risky, but visibility was fatal. And yet this same society that punished immorality also painted it in mosaics, wrote it into love songs, embroidered it on silk. The contradiction doesn't cancel, it fascinates. Imagine your virtue is policed, but your culture thrives on the very beauty that tempts it. That tension gives every glance an electric charge. You stop near a spice seller reciting couplets from 1001 Nights. He's quoting a story about two young men whose friendship grows too tender. The crowd chuckles knowingly. No one says love, but everyone knows. That's how stories traveled through tone, not text. It hits you that the bazaar wasn't just for goods. It was a theater, a confessional, a school of manners where attraction rehearsed itself daily under the watchful eyes of morality. Every buyer and seller performed refinement while testing its limits. In modern cities, people might scroll through dating apps under fluorescent lights. Here they traded glances over honey jars and quills. The rules haven't changed much. Pretend you're talking about price. Means something else entirely. You find a moment of calm near a fountain. Water glints like silver, and two apprentices wash their hands laughing. One flicks water at the other, who retaliates with a grin that's half mischief, half challenge. You look away out of politeness, but the scene lingers proof that tenderness, even forbidden, always finds a stage. At sunset, the bazaar folds itself back into shadow. Stalls close, lamps flicker, and the scent of musk thickens in the cooling air. The laughter fades, but the hum of longing remains. You can almost feel it like static in your fingertips as you step past the last archway. The streets fall quieter now, only the call of a distant storyteller breaking the dusk. He's reciting something about a caliph and a slave, about how beauty toppled kingdoms and made saints forget their prayers. You catch a few lines half drowned by the wind. To admire the rose is not sin unless you pluck it. You don't know whether he's warning or winking, maybe both. That's the market's secret. It never condemns it, only mirrors. And in that mirror, you catch a glimpse of your own reflection again. Eyes glimmering like someone who's seen too much and learned too little restraint. The scent of oud lingers in your hair as you climb marble steps slick with wax. Above you rises a hall of gold lattice and silk banners, the heart of empire where power and poetry flirt without shame. Welcome to the courts of the caliphs, where rumor walks faster than reason and affection has to wear armor. In these palaces, Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, the line between admiration and politics is thinner than parchment. Here a verse can make a career or end one. Courtiers compete not only for wealth, but for favor, which often has a face and a fragrance. The caliph's gaze could make a man unmake him or make him blush. You tread past carved cedar doors into a chamber of perfumes and low conversation. There's music, always music, and laughter so controlled it sounds rehearsed. You recognize one of the poets whose verses you read earlier. He sits cross-legged beside a cupbearer with cold, dark eyes and a smile like a secret. The caliph reclines nearby, pretending not to notice what everyone already does. Historians rarely say it plainly, but palace life was steeped in intimacy. Caliphs surrounded themselves with male attendants, eunuchs, pages, musicians, each trained to serve, entertain, and flatter. Some became confidants, some favorites, and some. Let's just say history starts coughing discreetly at that point. Take Al-Amin's son of the great Harun al-Rashid. Chroniclers whispered that he loved his male courtiers so openly it made diplomats nervous. He appointed them to high ranks, wrote them poems, and threw feasts that blended wine with wistfulness. His downfall, they say, came as much from politics as from perception. Baghdad could forgive almost anything except a rumor that felt too true. You walk past a mosaic depicting a falconer and his page. The bird perches between them, caught mid-flight, frozen in gold and lapis. A servant nearby murmurs, "The falcon is loyalty." You look closer and see it, the falcon's leash connects both men's wrists. Subtle, not really. Safe, barely. In Al-Andalus, the courts of Cordoba and Granada refined this art of suggestion even further. Their Arabic merged with Romance tongues, and the poetry of love, male or female, found a new elegance. The Umayyad Prince Al-Hakam II kept poets like Ibn Abdrabi and musicians like Ziryab at his court, both of whom celebrated beauty in all its forms. Andalusian culture prized refinement so much that even affection between men could be admired, so long as it stayed poetic, not political. But not every story ends in melody. You overhear a eunuch whispering that one courtier, a young singer named Mutamid of Seville, rose too high on charm. When he became king, He filled his palace with poets and lovers, male and female alike. For a time, it seemed paradise had found an earthly address. Then came war, betrayal, exile. Love, it turns out, is a poor shield against armies. Still, those courts left behind libraries of longing. Scrolls from this era describe banquets where poets recited verses to applause so heavy it disguised the sound of hearts breaking. It was theater, diplomacy, and temptation rolled into one. You imagine the room lit by oil lamps, shadows pooling in corners, while every word trembled on the edge of scandal. At one such feast, a poet named Abu Bakr al-Turtushi reportedly advised a friend, "If you must fall in love, do it with someone above your station. It makes the heartbreak more memorable." You can't tell if that's wisdom or masochism. Maybe both. In those days, the caliph's reputation mattered more than his private truth. So the empire built two histories. The official one polished and pious, and the hidden one soft and perfumed. The first was written in ink, the second in rumor. You realize how much of human life survives in that second version. The whispers, the glances, the verses tucked into margins. Even the art hinted at it. Miniature paintings from the later Ottoman and Persian worlds show gatherings of men in gardens reclining under vines, passing cups, exchanging looks too tender to be accidental. Modern curators call it aesthetic idealization. You might call it honesty, smuggled under the radar. As you pass down a corridor lined with silks, you notice the patterns repeat endlessly. Geometry chasing its own tail. Maybe that's what love was. In these courts, perfect, symmetrical, impossible to escape. Someone nearby begins to sing. The melody is delicate, the words ancient. When I look upon beauty, I see the face of God and tremble. For a moment, you understand what the scholars meant, that devotion and desire were twin reflections in the same pool. You leave the hall and step out into moonlight. Behind you, laughter ripples through the windows, mingling with the sound of string instruments. The palace glows like a lantern, fragile and dazzling, held together by poetry and secrets. You can almost hear Abu Nuwas laughing again somewhere in the past, raising a cup to those who dared to love, where love was safest in metaphor. The clatter of armor replaces the music of the court. Dawn seeps over the desert like smoke as you find yourself among soldiers, rows of them polishing blades, adjusting saddles, teasing each other in a dozen dialects. The air smells of sweat iron and loyalty. You've stepped into the world of the Mamluks, soldiers who were slaves, servants who became kings, and men who lived closer to one another than any law could comfortably allow. The Mamluk system was an architectural marvel of control. Boys, often from Central Asia or the Caucasus, were brought to Islamic lands, trained in arms, educated in faith, and molded into elite warriors. They weren't born into power. They were built for it. And because they were cut off from families, tribes, and ordinary life, their brotherhoods became their homes, their commanders, their fathers, and their comrades. Sometimes something more complicated. You walk through the barracks, low ceilings, straw mats, oil lamps flickering over armor, lined up like sleeping sentinels. At night the cold is fierce, and men huddle for warmth. A joke, a shove, a shared blanket, innocence and intimacy always sit side by side. Historians will later call these bonds futua, chivalric brotherhoods, codes of loyalty that bound men tighter than blood. Still, rumor has never respected the difference between loyalty and love. Chronicles hint at affection that crossed the unspoken boundary. The historian al-Makrizi once noted how some soldiers loved their brothers more than themselves. And though he meant it as praise for courage, the line still blushes centuries later. You sit beside a campfire where two young Mamluks share bread. Their laughter is easy, Their glances are not. One teases the other about his horse, about his sword, about how the Sultan's daughter looked at him. The other rolls his eyes, mutters something under his breath, and throws a date pit into the fire. The sparks leap up like punctuation. When night falls, they sleep side by side, the desert freezing outside their tent. You think of modern soldiers, photos of wartime camaraderie, arms slung over shoulders. The tenderness of survival doesn't ask permission. It just happens. There's a word that appears in Sufi and military texts like suba, companionship. It means brotherhood, but also a kind of spiritual intimacy. In Sufi orders, suhba bound disciples to their masters. In armies, it bound fighters to one another. The line between sacred and personal often blurred. One mystic wrote, "He who sees the face of his companion as the light of God has already worshipped." You wonder if soldiers prayed to that same idea without knowing. During the Crusades, Muslim chroniclers often marveled at how their Christian enemies seemed to misunderstand discipline as cruelty. "We fight for love," one Mamluk commander said, "for the eyes of our brothers who will die beside us." You can't tell if that was metaphor or confession, but either way, it feels like truth. In Cairo, centuries later, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, once a slave himself, ruled with both iron and affection. His court was full of trusted comrades he'd trained with since boyhood. Chroniclers described their loyalty as unbreakable, though a few hinted that it bordered on obsession. He could not dine without them, one record says, nor ride nor rest. It's not evidence, just emotion disguised as history. You pause at a blacksmith's forge. Sparks leap as metal meets metal, and an older soldier tells you, "We were raised without mothers or wives. We only knew the men beside us." He shrugs. When one fell, part of you stayed down there with him. You realize that what he's describing isn't scandal. It's the cost of belonging. Even centuries later, Ottoman Janissaries, descendants of the Mamluk tradition, would live in barracks that felt more like monastic orders. Some were forbidden to marry, others chose not to. Brotherhood, loyalty, and a shared sense of fate formed a world unto itself. "The sword has two edges," they used to say. "One cuts the enemy, the other the heart." You lie awake that night under a tent roof, humming with wind. The sounds outside, the shuffle of boots, the faint murmur of a prayer, blend into something human fragile. You think about how societies that feared male tenderness still relied on it to win wars. Maybe that's the irony at the center of it all. The same culture that criminalized intimacy between men built empires on the trust born from it. The fire dies down to embers. In the faint red glow, you see two Mamluks asleep, their helmets beside them, their hands almost touching. It isn't a declaration, it's survival shaped like grace. By morning, they'll mount their horses, ride into formation, and shout God's name into the dust. But for now, in the hush between night and dawn, the barracks are a world of quiet warmth and unspoken truths. Behind the lattice, the world breathes differently. You step through a corridor draped with curtains, the air thick with rosewater and secrecy. It's quiet enough to hear your own sandals on the tiles. You've entered the women's quarters where life moves behind carved screens and desire speaks in whispers softer than the breeze through silk. For centuries, travelers wrote about the splendor of harems, but rarely about their reality. Here, harem doesn't mean decadence. It means restriction, protection, and paradox. The women you meet are scholars, poets, and musicians, not just ornaments of beauty. Yet even brilliance must bend beneath confinement. And where there's confinement, there's invention. A servant slides past you carrying a copper tray of pomegranates. The air smells of cloves and ink. In one corner, two women embroider verses from the Quran, golden thread looping through linen. At first glance, they're model piety. But listen closely, and you hear them murmuring couplets about love, ambiguous ones. Her eyes are daggers, her words honey. Who is her? No one dares to ask. It's easy to forget that women too wrote love poetry in the medieval Islamic world, and sometimes their beloved wore no label. In the 10th century, the poet Walada bint al-Mustakfi of Cordoba defied all norms. She held salons where men and women recited verse together, and she signed her poems with lines like, "By God, I am made for greatness, and I walk proudly among lovers." Bold, absolutely. Dangerous without question. You pass a painted screen depicting women at a fountain splashing each other playfully. A guard looks away, pretending not to notice. In spaces like this, affection could be safety, rebellion, or both. Many women lived under constant surveillance, their emotional lives trimmed to fit the shape of expectation. Yet history is full of letters, songs, and tales hinting at tenderness between them. A bond born from shared captivity, shared longing. In Sufi convents and women's lodges, spiritual sisterhood often blurred into something more intimate. The mystic Rabia al-Adawiyya spoke of divine love as consuming fire. I love God not for fear of hell, nor for desire of heaven, but for love alone. Her followers used similar language for their devotion to God, to saints, to one another. Some later poets borrowed her words, replacing God with beloved. You start to see how easily the spiritual became personal. A woman named al-Kiram, a scholar in 11th century Baghdad, wrote letters to her female pupils that shimmer with tenderness. "You are the lamp of my nights," one reads. "When you recite before me, I forget the world." It could be mentorship or something more. The ambiguity feels deliberate, as if love was safer when dressed in scholarship. You find a corner where musicians rehearse. One plucks an oud, another hums under her breath, the melody low and heavy. The lyrics tell of two women who meet in a garden at dawn, veiled faces close enough to share breath. No names, no endings, just the sound of longing folded into song. You can almost hear the echo of it centuries later in quiet rooms where women still hum to themselves when no one listens. If the men outside hid their affections in metaphor, women mastered invisibility. Their world was built on concealment, behind veils, behind walls, behind the names of fathers and husbands. Yet within that darkness bloomed entire languages of glances and perfume of gifts exchanged in secret. Historians call it subtext. You might call it survival through softness. A scholar once said that power and love can never share the same room. But here you realize they must. Every act of affection between women behind these screens, whether spiritual, friendly, or romantic, is an act of quiet defiance. In a culture that demanded modesty, even tenderness became resistance. As you walk, you hear laughter from deeper within the harem. It isn't the laughter of gossip. It's joy without permission. You peek through the screen. A small circle of women are sharing stories under lantern light, their voices rising like petals carried by wind. They speak of men, yes, but also of one another. Their admiration, their envy, their endless patience. In every word there's intimacy woven through caution. Outside, the city roars with sermons and markets. Inside, this enclosed world hums with parallel truths. You think of modern parallels, friendships that blur lines, quiet alliances formed in offices or dorm rooms, the way affection finds loopholes wherever rules grow too tight. The centuries change, but the choreography doesn't. A maid refills your cup with spiced milk and whispers, "Careful, master. What the world forbids, poetry remembers." You nod. She's right. Every secret gesture here, every embroidered verse, every look held a second too long survives in the language of metaphor that outlived its keepers. Somewhere behind you, the muezzin calls the night prayer. The women pause, veil themselves, and kneel in unison. The same voices that whispered forbidden verses now recite sacred words. The rhythm is the same faith and love, woven together so tightly, no blade could separate them. You step out through the carved door, the scent of jasmine still clinging to your sleeves. Behind you, the screens close, softly sealing away a world that history barely dared to name, but never managed to silence. The air turns smoky and slow as you follow the faint thrum of drums through a back alley. Lanterns flicker like eyes, and the scent of frankincense swirls around your ankles. You've left the palace and the harem behind. Now you're entering a world where the rules of love are rewritten not by law, but by longing. Welcome to the Sufi lodges where mystics chase the divine through poetry, dance, and an intimacy that could burn saints to ash. You hear chanting before you see the circle. Dozens of men sway together, hands clasped, breath synchronized. They chant the names of God, their voices melting into rhythm until it sounds less like prayer and more like heartbeat. In the center, a young dervish turns slowly, his robe blooming outward like a white flame. His eyes are half-closed, tears glinting. It's devotion, yes, but also something deeper, almost unbearable in its tenderness. The Sufis called it ishq, passionate love, a flame that consumes everything, separating the lover from the beloved. The beloved, of course, was God. But the language they used, the lips, the eyes, the yearning could just as easily describe a human. And sometimes it did. If I mistake God's face for a friend's one, Sufi joked, it's because beauty is the same garment, just worn differently. You sit beside the wall, feeling the vibration of their chants in your chest. They believe love is a ladder. You start with the beauty you can see and climb toward the beauty you can't. So admiring another person's face wasn't condemned. It was considered a spark, one that, if guided rightly, could ignite the soul instead of the body. Of course, not everyone climbed that ladder perfectly. The poet Jalal al-Din Rumi wrote of his beloved Shams of Tabriz with such fierce devotion that later scholars still argue, was it divine or human love? Maybe both. "What can I do, my friends?" he wrote. "My beloved is within me. Every breath I take is from him." When Shams disappeared, murdered, perhaps exiled, Rumi wandered the streets, reciting verses of grief that sound like scripture soaked in heartbreak. If this was heresy, it was also humanity in its purest form. Around the fire, a gray-bearded Sufi smiles at you. "We do not sin by loving," he says softly. "We sin by stopping." His words hang in the air like incense. He tells you that to love deeply, even dangerously, is to glimpse the divine, because the heart recognizes what logic denies. It's the same paradox the scholars argued over. But here it's lived instead of theorized. You watch as a disciple refills the master's cup with rosewater fingers, brushing his wrist. The gesture is brief, almost reverent. Their eyes meet, and for a heartbeat time feels like it holds its breath. You realize how in Sufism, physical closeness often mirrors spiritual nearness. The disciple yearns to reflect the master's perfection. The master sees God in the disciple's devotion. To outsiders, it might look like affection. To insiders, it is affection just translated into theology. Even female mystics practice this kind of intimacy. In Basra, women gathered in zawiyas, spiritual lodges, to sing the praises of the beloved. Their voices braided into chants so full of emotion that even the air seemed to tremble. A chronicler once wrote of a woman who fainted during dhikr remembrance, and upon waking whispered, "I thought I had touched the hem of God's robe." Her companions wept not in fear, but envy. You notice how these mystics didn't run from desire, they rerouted it. The poet Attar said, "When you fall in love, you begin the pilgrimage." In his epic Conference of the Birds, the seekers chase God across deserts only to discover that the beloved was mirrored in themselves all along. Love, he implied, is the journey, not the sin. The drumming grows faster now. The dervishes spin robes, flaring like waves. You close your eyes dizzy from the movement, the sound, the scent of sandalwood. It's easy to see how someone could mistake this ecstasy for madness or mistake it for romance. But isn't that the same mistake the heart makes every century? It feels something vast, and the mind rushes to give it a name. In another corner, a group of younger disciples copy poems into manuscripts by lamplight. The calligraphy twists like vines. One line catches your eye. Between lover and beloved, there is no between. The ink glistens as if still wet. You realize that Sufi art was never abstract. It was deeply embodied. Every metaphor, every sigh of yearning came from lived feeling. Outside the lodge, the night has deepened. Stars scatter across the sky like silver script. The chanting fades to a hum, and you walk out barefoot, the earth cool beneath you. The world feels sharper now, edges softened by what you've seen. You think of how Sufis turned every heartbeat into prayer, every glance into revelation. Maybe that's what makes this part of history so haunting. It shows how a civilization that feared desire still built a spirituality around it. They didn't destroy longing, they sanctified it. A breeze stirs the lamp beside you, and you hear one last verse from inside. I searched for God and found only love. I searched for love and found only God. You don't know if it's devotion or confession. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. The chanting fades behind you as you step into a very different kind of chamber. One where words weigh heavier than prayers. A Qadi's court. The marble is cold, the air sober, and the scent of ink and judgment replaces the perfume of mystics. Here love is no longer a metaphor. It's an accusation. A clerk reads from a leather-bound register, his voice measured names, dates, suspicions. You realize this is how intimacy becomes evidence, when someone's glance lasts too long, when poetry feels too specific, when envy turns into testimony. But most of these records end not in punishment, but in silence. For all the moral rhetoric, the historical truth is that actual prosecutions for same-sex acts were rare. Too many rules of proof, too many chances for mercy or willful blindness. The Qadi sits like a mountain behind his desk, his beard white, his eyes tired. He knows what the law says. He also knows what life is. According to jurists of the time, 4 witnesses were required to prove an indecent act beyond doubt. 4 men all seeing the same thing, all agreeing on every detail. You can almost hear him sigh. That's less a legal standard than a way of saying, let's not look too hard. A scholar beside you whispers, in theory, the punishment is severe. In practice, God alone judges the hidden. You sense relief in that ambiguity. Society might police appearances, but the human heart remains ungovernable territory. You remember what you've seen in the courts, the harems, the lodges. The same empire that recited poetry about love also built walls around it. The paradox tightens here. Punishment exists on parchment, forgiveness in practice. It's as if the law itself knows that the world would collapse if it punished every human weakness it preached against. One of the clerks leans over to show you a volume of fiqh Islamic jurisprudence. He points to passages from the Hanafi and Maliki schools, two of the four great legal traditions. The text is calm, precise, almost clinical. Desire between men forbidden. Proof nearly impossible. Admonition encouraged. Punishment only under impossible conditions. You see what's happening, law. Law as deterrent theater, not as executioner. That said, fear is still real. Chronicles from Damascus tell of crackdowns during moral panics, of sultans ordering the expulsion of corrupt youths from their cities. But the same chronicles also admit those exiles rarely lasted. They were quietly recalled when tempers cooled or poetry became too lonely. It's like a pendulum society, oscillating between moral fervor and reluctant tolerance. You catch sight of a young man trembling before the judge. The accusation is vague, inappropriate friendship, a phrase elastic enough to stretch around any closeness. The Qadi listens, eyes half-lidded, then waves it away. Advise them privately, he murmurs. Public shame benefits no one. The clerk nods, relieved. The young man bows and hurries out, shoulders shaking with gratitude or terror, you can't tell which. You think of how even now societies everywhere build systems that both condemn and depend on discretion. We still whisper what we can't legislate, still write rules that hinge on looking away at the right time. Maybe that's what mercy often is, the choice not to see too clearly. As you leave the courtroom, you pass walls covered in old edicts. One reads, "Punish the act, not the inclination." Another, "If you find beauty troubling, lower your gaze." And somewhere in between those lines, the whole culture seems to sigh. Beauty never stops existing, only permission does. Outside, the street feels lighter, brighter. You find a tea stall near the courthouse steps where a few scholars debate under an awning. One quotes the theologian Ibn Qayyim, who once said, "The heart that loves in secret is closer to God than the tongue that condemns aloud." His companions nod. No one argues. It strikes you that this society's strength wasn't in moral perfection, but in moral negotiation. Everyone from caliph to calligrapher lived somewhere between fear and fascination. The result wasn't chaos. It was a strangely balanced hypocrisy, one that allowed art to flourish while law looked the other way. You sip your tea. The steam fogs your reflection in the brass cup. How many hearts, you wonder, hid behind such steam centuries ago? How many men and women sat right here quoting holy texts to justify the ache they couldn't name? Across the square, a preacher begins his sermon. His voice echoes against stone guard your gaze. The devil rides the glance. Yet even as he speaks, a group of students recite ghazals on a nearby step, verses so drenched in yearning they could melt the marble. The contradiction is dizzying and deeply human. Maybe that's the secret rhythm of this world punishment on paper, poetry, and practice. The system holds, not because it's perfect, but because everyone quietly agrees to let beauty live, even when pretending not to see it. As the call to prayer begins, the preacher lowers his voice. The tea stall empties, and you realize faith endures. Law adapts, but love simply waits for the noise to die down. The night wind carries centuries on its breath. You stand beneath a minaret in Cairo. the stone cool under your palm, and you can feel it echoes of laughter from courtyards, the hum of verses that once dared to name the unnamed. The world around you is modern now. Cars, lights, voices, but somewhere behind the noise, the old heartbeat still thuds. Love buried alive never stayed buried. History doesn't preserve secrets, it just renames them. The same poems that once fluttered through candlelight now survive in museums and anthologies. Abu Nuwas's verses are printed on glossy pages. Rumi's confessions are sold in airports as self-help. The irony isn't lost on you. What was once whispered under threat of punishment is now printed on tote bags. Humanity, it seems, loves to commercialize the dangerous once it's safe. But look closer. Beneath translation and polite commentary, the raw pulse is still there, the yearning, the audacity, the ache of living in a world that demanded silence. You can still hear it in the pauses between Rumi's lines, in Walada's defiant signatures, in the careful word choices of jurists who both feared and pitied desire. Tonight the city glows electric. The same crescent moon that watched over Abbasid Baghdad now hovers above glass towers. You wonder if it remembers the rooftop poets and the restless soldiers, the veiled women trading glances, the dervishes spinning until they vanished into light. Hooked again. You should be. Because this isn't nostalgia, it's proof. Proof that love is more durable than the rules built to contain it. The empires crumbled, the mosques and minarets were rebuilt, but the poetry never stopped. Each generation copied it, quoted it, disguised it anew. And every time a verse described a beloved with eyes like stars, someone somewhere knew exactly what that meant. You walk through a modern bookshop. The shelves gleam with translations of medieval poets, Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish, all promising wisdom of the mystics. You pick one up. The introduction praises the spiritual symbolism of the beloved. But you, after this long journey, can't help smiling. You know that beloved once had a body, a scent, a voice that could tremble. You know what was risked for those metaphors. It's easy to see the past as a place of repression, but that misses the point. What's more remarkable is how people refused to let love die, even when it had to disguise itself as faith or art. They didn't destroy desire, they transformed it into something immortal. The French philosopher Foucault once said, "Where there is power, there is resistance." But here resistance didn't shout, it sang. It embroidered it, danced it, rhymed. Every forbidden affection became a masterpiece of disguise. Every silence became an invitation to listen harder. And maybe that's the lesson this whole history leaves in your hands tonight. You can outlaw a gesture, you can censor a poem, but you can't legislate what someone sees when they look at beauty. The medieval Islamic world knew that. It feared it, but it also built entire libraries around it. The irony burns bright in condemning desire, they preserved it. The call to prayer begins again the 5th of the day. The voice rises pure and unbroken, curling over the rooftops. You close your eyes. For a moment it sounds like a love song. Maybe it always was. The line between worship and longing has always been thinner than anyone admits. You think back to the faces you've met along this journey. The poet laughing beside a fountain, the scholar tracing theology with trembling hands, the soldiers sharing bread by firelight, the veiled women stitching verses into fabric, the mystics spinning towards something nameless. They were all trying to say the same thing. I see something beautiful, and I don't know where to put it. History doesn't absolve them, but it does illuminate them. It shows how courage sometimes means not rebellion, but endurance, the quiet defiance of continuing to feel in a world that would rather you didn't. You turn down a narrow street lined with lights. A shopkeeper hums a tune older than memory. Somewhere a boy recites a verse about a beloved's eyes like night. The same metaphor recycled 1,000 years later still holds power. You can almost hear Abu Nuwas chuckling in approval. Before you leave, you glance back at the minaret. The moon catches on its edge, the same pale gleam that once watched over hidden gardens and smoky gatherings. You whisper to the night, not as a prayer, but as acknowledgement. Love never left. It just changed its accent. You take a breath. The air tastes of cardamom dust and continuity. The story isn't over. It never was. It only pauses between one generation's silence and the next one's rediscovery. Somewhere another poet is writing by phone light, trying to find the right metaphor for what cannot be said directly. You tell them they're part of a tradition far older than they know. You tell them history is full of people like them whispering what the world wasn't ready to hear. The muezzin's voice fades. The city exhales. And you, listener, wanderer, late-night historian, finally understand what survives isn't scandal. It's tenderness. What endures isn't rebellion. It's recognition. And as the last note drifts into the dark, you realize this story was never untold. It was always here waiting in the pause between two heartbeats. From poets and secret lovers, you now pass through another hidden gate into the hushed corridors of the royal palace, where the most trusted yet invisible figures move like shadows. They are the eunuch's guardians of the harem, keepers of secrets, and silent witnesses to centuries of desire, power, and deception. Welcome to the hidden world of eunuchs in Islamic palaces. They say silence has weight. And tonight you feel it pressing against your chest the moment you step through the bronze doors. The hinges sigh like old men remembering, and the air inside is thick, perfumed, and utterly still. A few feet behind you, the city of Cairo keeps roaring donkeys, muezzins, market cries, but here in the palace sound stops. You can almost hear your heartbeat bumping against marble. Welcome to the empire's quietest world, the realm of the eunuchs. You don't see them at first. That's part of their craft. They move like shadows barefoot, soft, trained to vanish between curtains. They carry keys, fans, letters, and secrets, and yet they are the invisible scaffolding holding the palace together. No one outside these walls knows their names, but every prince, sultan, and concubine owes them something. Imagine being a walking lock trusted to hold the doors that power itself walks through. The first thing you notice is the smell: amber oil, sandalwood, a hint of metal. The walls are high, their tiles catching candlelight like frozen rivers. You pass a fountain murmuring beneath a dome. And beside it stands one of them, tall, dark-skinned, robed in white. His eyes meet yours, unreadable, trained to reveal nothing. Once long ago, he was a boy from the Upper Nile, or maybe from Ethiopia. Maybe his mother sold him to survive. Maybe soldiers took him. The truth vanished with the cut that made him what he is. Every empire that ever grew too rich invented eunuchs. The Abbasids had them. The Mamluks multiplied them. The Ottomans perfected them. Why? Because power, in its paranoia, always craves someone who can see everything, yet desire nothing, or so it hopes. You can almost picture a caliph whispering to his vizier, "Find me servants who cannot betray me through lust or lineage." And so, from Nubian villages and Ethiopian highlands, caravans brought boys who would be remade in the name of purity. You follow the echo of their footsteps deeper inside. Each arch you pass is carved with verses praising mercy. though mercy rarely found a home here. Eunuchs weren't just guards, they were the hinges of history. They decided who saw the ruler, who got silenced, who entered the harem, who left it alive. Yet for all their access, they had no place outside the gates. The city called them neither man nor woman, a thing between worlds. It's strange, isn't it, to live in the heart of luxury and remain unseen? To hold the Sultan's child in your arms, but know you'll never have one of your own. To hear laughter behind silken veils. You can't touch songs, you can't join power, you can only deliver. That paradox, trusted yet unwanted, was the soil from which their strange strength grew. A eunuch's silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. The less he said, the more he knew. The palace was a labyrinth of rumors, and every whisper eventually passed through him. They knew who poisoned the sherbet, who bribed the guards who stayed up too long in the women's quarters. If gossip were currency, eunuchs were the empire's bankers. You pause before a vast wooden screen, mashrabiyah carved with stars. Behind it, voices float in laughter, the music of anklets and fans. That's the harem, the forbidden quarter. Every other man in the empire would lose his head for stepping there. But the eunuchs, they walk through it as if through smoke. They are both allowed and not allowed, sacred and monstrous. And maybe that's the true beginning of their hidden world, not the knife, not the chains, but this in-between existence. They became mirrors for everyone else's desires and fears. To the Sultan, they were loyal extensions of will. To the concubines, they were confidants who could never touch. To the common people, they were creatures of superstition, half angels, half ghosts. You glance back at the doorway you came from. Outside, the night still hums with life. Inside, the palace breathes in slow ritual rhythm. Lanterns, prayers, footsteps, sighs. It feels like stepping inside the body of a giant, where the eunuchs are its quiet blood, flowing unseen but essential. And as you move down the corridor past a fresco of paradise gardens, a thought slides into your mind. What does it take to build a world that demands people erase themselves to keep it alive? The air cools as you reach a courtyard filled with moonlight and sleeping cats. One of them lifts its head to stare as if judging how you'll handle what comes next. Because beyond this garden lies the truth of how boys became ghosts, and ghosts became the empire's most trusted men. You wake before dawn in a courtyard where the marble still remembers yesterday's heat. Somewhere nearby, a rooster dares to crow inside the caliph's walls, brave bird. The palace never really sleeps. It just exhales slower at night. And as the call to prayer floats over the domes, you see the first figure move through the mist, a young eunuch in gray, carrying a bronze pitcher larger than his arm. He walks with care like the world might shatter if he trips. He wasn't born here. None of them were. Somewhere far away, across deserts or jungles, he had a name that sounded like laughter, a family that smelled of bread and smoke. And then a trader's promised gold for the boy who could sing or lift a jar, or simply look delicate enough to fetch a high price. Empires, you'll learn, often balance their elegance on someone else's childhood. The transformation began long before the palace. Some were taken by force, others sold by famine or false hope. Caravans carried them north to Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul. There the line between medicine and mutilation blurred beneath the knife. You want to look away, but history doesn't allow it. The procedure, brutal, secretive, often fatal, was done in silence without anesthesia. Only a few survived. Those who did woke into a new name, a new voice, a new fate. Imagine opening your eyes and realizing you have become property. No longer someone's son, just a servant fit for the harem. You might whisper, "Who am I now?" but no answer would come. The body would heal, but the old life wouldn't. The survivors were prized not for who they were, but for what they could never again be. And yet, from this cruelty, a strange power grew. The palace, in all its paranoia, needed servants who could never threaten its lineage. Eunuchs fit perfectly into that paranoid logic, safe men loyal by design. But survival made them sharper than their masters expected. Deprived of lineage, they built influence. Denied sons, they created protégés. Denied manhood, they mastered every skill that mattered. In the Ottoman court, black eunuchs from Sudan and Ethiopia rose highest. They guarded the harem, carried the sultan's seal, and controlled access to the throne itself. The chief black eunuch, Kislar Aga, could make or unmake a vizier with a whisper. When the sultan slept, he was the one who held the keys. The most feared man in the palace wasn't a general. It was the one who could walk past every locked door. Still, the hierarchy among eunuchs was fierce. Newly bought boys scrubbed floors and fetched coals. The older ones learned languages, etiquette, calligraphy, diplomacy. Their training was like a monastery mixed with a prison. Every gesture mattered: how to bow, when to smile, how to speak without speaking. A flicker of hesitation could end a career or a life. The older eunuchs trained the new ones with a mixture of cruelty and care. They knew what awaited outside: suspicion, ridicule, sometimes stones. Within the walls, at least, there was purpose. "You serve the palace," they would say, and the palace forgets nothing. It was both warning and comfort. You might think of them as servants, but they thought of themselves as guardians of an order older than any sultan. They handled everything the rulers couldn't: the sacred, the scandalous, the secret. From royal births to quiet assassinations, their fingerprints were everywhere, even if history refused to record them. If you listen closely, you can almost hear their voices echoing in the tiled corridors: soft accented Arabic, Turkish, Amharic, Greek languages blending like incense. Their stories rarely survive in chronicles. Yet every palace rule book, every royal decree carries traces of their hands. Occasionally, one escaped the labyrinth. In Cairo, you might meet an elderly eunuch living near Al-Azhar, wealthy from years of service, still walking upright, though the world no longer bows to him. People would whisper, "Blessed, cursed neither." He would smile thinly, hands steady on a cane, and reply, "I saw kings come and go." That is enough. Stripped of what the world calls manhood, they built a new definition of worth: discipline, precision, loyalty, memory. You start to wonder how much of humanity can be taken before what remains becomes something greater, not less. The boy with the pitcher passes by again, eyes lowered, feet steady on marble that has seen centuries. In him lives every survivor, every unnamed servant who turned loss into leverage. He disappears behind a latticed door, and the sound of water returns, steady cleansing, as if the palace is trying to wash its conscience. The harem's doors don't creak. They breathe. You press your palm against the carved cedar, and the air behind it feels warmer, scented with jasmine oud, and something faintly human skin perfume fear. The eunuch beside you nods once and pushes the door open. And suddenly you're standing at the threshold of the most forbidden world in the empire. The harem isn't what most people imagine. Forget the painting cliches of lounging women with grapes and silk. This is a government within a government, ruled by the Queen Mother, sustained by dozens of concubines, hundreds of servants, and guarded by eunuchs who hold the line between desire and death. Here, men without desire are the only men allowed in. You watch one of them glide across the tiled floor, silver tray balanced on a steady hand. He doesn't look left or right. He knows better. A single wrong glance could mean the bowstring, because in the Empire's logic, temptation was treason. The women talk freely around him, though half knowing he sees, half forgetting he exists. To them, he's like a lampstand, necessary, inanimate, safe. The harem hums with layers of sound, veiled laughter, quiet arguments, a lute plucking a melancholy scale. Somewhere a child's voice sings a prayer, probably a prince's son who doesn't yet realize that his entire destiny depends on which woman smiles at the right moment. You can't help but notice. It is how the eunuchs float between these lives, part witness, part wall. To the Sultan, the harem is legacy. To the women, it's survival. To the eunuchs, it's duty, an endless choreography of guarding, serving, reporting, and never belonging. Imagine being trusted with every secret that could unmake an empire, yet never having anyone to tell. The eunuchs kept the rhythm of this hidden court. When the Sultan would visit, which concubine would bathe, which servant was to be dismissed. They were the calendar of desire, the keepers of silence. Some of them found strange companionship among the women. Shared isolation does that. A concubine might whisper a worry to the eunuch who combs her hair. Another might slip him a coin to carry a note to the chief black eunuch. For all the strictness, life inside was full of tiny rebellions. A glance, a rumor, a delayed message. And behind each rebellion, a eunuch deciding whether to notice. You wonder how they felt moving through such beauty untouchable. Maybe like museum guards walking through priceless paintings they can never own. Or like priests in a temple serving a god they no longer believe in. One chronicler wrote that the best eunuchs were those who saw without seeing, heard without hearing, and remembered everything. Sometimes they became allies of the women they guarded. In the Ottoman court, the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, ruled much of the empire through her chief eunuch. Together, they were invisible government. She shaped policy through whispers. He carried them into action. The Grand Vizier might have armies, but the chief eunuch had access to the bedroom door, and that was worth far more. Picture the daily routine before sunrise. Eunuchs sweep through the harem. Checking locks, curtains, corridors. They deliver messages sealed with the Sultan's tugra, serve breakfast to the women of rank, escort teachers for the young princes. By noon, petitions and bribes have already started circulating. Every step is watched, every word weighed. And yet, there's humanity in the cracks. You spot an older eunuch laughing quietly as a child pulls his robe. Another adjusts a lamp wick, humming a tune from his homeland. Even in this carefully engineered world, memory leaks through. You can't erase where you came from, only polish it until it reflects the palace's glow. Occasionally, a eunuch would slip an unauthorized glance a moment too long by the fountain and vanish by morning. The palace explained such disappearances with silence, the most efficient language of all. Everyone understood. Fear kept the order running smoother than any decree. But the strangest thing isn't their obedience, it's their endurance. Generation after generation, they built a tradition of service so deep it became sacred. The harem's women might change, dynasties might fall, but the eunuchs remained, guardians of the empire's most private truths. They were like the palace's heartbeat, steady, unseen, indispensable. You lean against a marble column, the hum of voices fading behind a veil of incense. For a moment it feels like time has folded, and you can almost hear them, still the shuffling slippers, the polite coughs, the murmured effendim. You realize this wasn't just a palace. It was an ecosystem of control, beauty, fear, and discipline, all balanced on men who were no longer quite men. And somewhere beyond the lattice, another eunuch waits to lead you deeper. Not toward silk and laughter now, but toward the darker corridors where power itself learns to whisper. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks barefoot down a corridor and bows. That's the sound of the shadow hierarchy, the invisible government of eunuchs that kept Islamic palaces running long after emperors forgot who they were. By the time you reach this layer of the palace, you realize rank here isn't measured by gold or sword, but by silence. The louder a man boasts, the closer he is to losing his post. The quiet ones, the ones whose eyes move first, whose lips barely twitch when they hear gossip, those are the ones who rule. The eunuchs have their own court, their own chain of command, even their own punishments. At the top stands the chief black eunuch, the Kisler Aga of the Ottoman world, or his counterparts in earlier caliphates. He's the guardian of the harem, the messenger of the sultan, and sometimes the only person who can walk straight into the royal chamber without being announced. When he clears his throat, viziers stop mid-sentence. You see him now, tall, draped in layered silk, his turban ringed with a single emerald that flashes whenever torchlight bends his way. His expression is carved out of marble, unreadable, absolute. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. Even the Janissary captain stiffens when he passes. Everyone knows that behind this calm face lies a map of every secret route, every betrayal, every letter sealed with false wax. Below him stretches a meticulous pyramid of roles, the first chamberlain keeper of keys, steward of baths, chief scribe, and dozens more. Each position has its privileges and dangers. The closer you get to the throne, the sharper the knives, metaphorically most days. A misplaced word could mean demotion to the stables, or exile to Mecca under the guise of piety. Eunuchs competed, but not like courtiers in open feuds. Their battles were subtle, who controlled the flow of gifts from foreign envoys, who whispered first into the sultan's mother's ear, who could erase a name from a list before dawn. Think of it as palace chess, but the board is alive, and losing doesn't mean checkmate, it means disappearance. You might wonder, how could men who owned nothing wield such power? The answer is simple: access. While viziers and generals waited outside, the chief eunuch could walk straight into harem or the sultan's study. He was the courier of intimacy, the bridge between the ruler's private world and public face. A glance from him could destroy a career faster than any decree. History gives us names like Hadum Suleiman Aga and Beshir Aga, who built mosques, libraries, and endowments across Istanbul and Cairo. These men began as property and ended as patrons. Their power wasn't hereditary, it was earned in the dark through loyalty, cleverness, and impeccable timing. A sultan could lose his throne overnight. A great eunuch could survive 5 reigns. You walk through their administrative quarters rooms, filled with scrolls, seal boxes, and ledgers written in elegant calligraphy. This is where the empire's veins converge. Messages arrive from Mecca, Algiers, Damascus, even Venice. Each read summarized and passed upward or quietly buried. A eunuch's desk isn't just a workplace. It's a filter that decides what the ruler knows, and sometimes what he never will. Imagine the responsibility. To touch every secret yet own none. To be indispensable yet easily replaced. To be the closest to the throne yet never sit upon it. Maybe that's why their loyalty was so absolute. It wasn't love of empire, but love of relevance. The palace had stripped them of everything else. Power became their only inheritance. Sometimes at night a younger eunuch might ask the older one, "Do you ever wish you'd been born whole?" The older would smile, not kindly, not cruelly, and answer, "Wholeness is overrated. Survival lasts longer." Then he'd pour more sherbet and return to his papers. What fascinates you most isn't their ambition, it's their serenity. They moved through chaos with the detachment of librarians in a burning archive. When rebellions broke out, when viziers were strangled, when new princes took the throne, the eunuchs simply adjusted like the marble pillars that outlived every sultan. If you listen closely now, you'll hear the faint creak of quills scratching across parchment. Somewhere a candle flickers beside a sealed decree, its wax still warm. A eunuch dips his pen, pauses, and writes a name that will change someone's life by sunrise. And as you stand in that silent corridor, it hits you. This wasn't just servitude. It was an empire within an empire, one ruled by men who no longer existed in the world's eyes, yet shaped it from the shadows. If the previous corridors smelled of incense and protocol, this one smells of sweat ink and crushed rose petals, the scent of administration and intrigue. You step into a vaulted chamber where eunuchs glide between desks like monks tending a secret scripture. They are the pulse behind every royal decision, though the sultan may never know their names. On one table lies a box of emerald rings meant for foreign envoys. On another, sealed scrolls destined for provinces hundreds of miles away. A senior eunuch leans over a map marking red wax dots along the caravan routes. Tribute shipments, pilgrim escorts, tax collections. And tucked beneath his sleeve, a smaller hidden note carrying news of something far more delicate, a minister's betrayal. This is where the empire hums. Letters, poisons, jewels, and whispers all pass through the same hands. The eunuchs are both postal clerks and puppet masters. One wrong seal, one missing comma in a royal decree, could start a war or end one quietly before breakfast. Their reputation for cunning wasn't undeserved. Some learned to read people the way others read ledgers. If a courier trembled, if an official's ink stroke grew heavy, they noticed. Trust is a luxury an old eunuch might mutter, and we've already paid for it with our bodies. It wasn't cynicism, it was clarity. When you've lost everything, clarity is the only power left. Take, for example, the court of Sultan Ahmed Burs. His chief eunuch, Beshir Aga, was said to receive more petitions than the Grand Vizier. Everyone from poets to generals slipped him bribes disguised as gifts, silk shawls, Persian tea, carved prayer beads. He'd accept them all with a serene smile, never promising anything. But if he liked you, your paper rose to the top of the pile. If not, it simply vanished, eaten by the silence of bureaucracy. And not all work here was bloodless. Some eunuchs became the empire's fixers, a poisoned cup delivered to the wrong prince. A night raid timed precisely when the target would be alone. History doesn't record their names. It only records the smoothness with which crises resolve themselves. They were the lubricants of monarchy, the ones who made impossible transitions seem inevitable. It's strange how comfortable they looked among danger. You'd expect paranoia, but what you find is calm ritual. They ink seals sprinkle rose water on paper fold. Each decree with geometric precision. To them, order is sacred. After all, the universe once tried to erase them. Now, they preserve its balance in return. At noon, sunlight cuts across the lattice windows, painting patterns on the floor. A young eunuch enters, carrying a silver tray of sherbet for the senior scribes. His hands tremble slightly, perhaps from fear or from the weight of the tray. It's impossible to tell. He sets it down, bows, and leaves without a word. No one thanks him. They never do. Gratitude here is currency too precious to spend on small gestures. You wonder how many secrets die in this room each week. How many confessions were swallowed in the name of loyalty? Maybe the eunuchs themselves forgot which truths belonged to which reign. After decades of service, memory turns into architecture, every tile a story, every stain a silence. There's humor too dry as desert air. One record from Cairo tells of a eunuch who accidentally delivered the same letter of flattery to two rival viziers. When both showed up at court expecting favor, he simply bowed and said, "His Majesty favors loyalty, especially in pairs." The Sultan laughed so hard, he promoted him. The lesson in the palace: even mistakes could be tools if polished well enough. Still, the cost of perfection never leaves. Imagine living a life where a misplaced word might end generations of quiet work, where every breath carries the weight of ceremony. You begin to understand why they spoke softly, why they walked like cats on marble. Silence wasn't just etiquette, it was insurance. By dusk, candles bloom across the room like tiny suns. The scribes roll their scrolls and press seals into soft wax. Somewhere a falconer calls from the courtyard, signaling another dispatch bound for the provinces. You step closer to the table and notice a single droplet of red wax cooling into the shape of a tear. The eunuch who sealed it doesn't notice or pretends not to. Because in this palace, duty is thicker than sorrow, and even the smallest act, pressing a seal, delivering a letter, can decide who wakes up tomorrow wearing silk and who doesn't wake up at all. You'd think power feels like freedom. But in the palace, it feels more like velvet chains. You step into the private quarters of the high eunuchs, lavishly tiled, perfumed, candlelit, and realize that this is luxury with a locked door. They live in splendor, yes, but every inch of it is borrowed. The empire gives them gold titles, silks, but never keys to the outside. A servant unrolls a rug, stitched with Quranic verses. Another pours sherbet into crystal cups. The room glitters: ivory fans, brass mirrors, embroidered cushions. It could pass for a prince's chamber, if not for the silence. You glance at the walls, thick, windowless, soundproofed. It's comfort with conditions, abundance wrapped in obedience. Here lives the paradox of the eunuch. He commands everyone and belongs to no one. His power is immense but temporary, like fire held in a silk glove. A single accusation, one rumor whispered by a jealous vizier, and this palace could become a tomb overnight. Still, they made the most of their confinement. Many became scholars, art patrons, even builders. The chief eunuch of Medina, for instance, commissioned fountains and libraries that still stand. In Istanbul, others endowed schools for orphans, hoping to raise children they could never father. If legacy was denied by nature, they built it through memory. You notice the small details of daily life. In one corner, an older eunuch polishes his prayer beads, counting not just sins, but decisions. Another plays a reed flute, softly, notes so fragile they sound like they might crumble in midair. A third writes in a diary that no one will ever read, the ink glinting like regret. You might think this sounds tragic. It is, but it's also strangely dignified. The palace trapped them, but it also became their canvas. They turned duty into art. Their movements, their precision, their restraint. It's all choreography. Even the way they kneel to light a lamp feels rehearsed, graceful, controlled. And outside, beyond the lattice, the city lives in chaos. Barkers shouting, camels, bawling merchants, arguing. You can almost hear it through the walls, a reminder that somewhere out there, people breathe without permission. Does that make them freer? Maybe. Or maybe the palace's safety is its own kind of seduction. One eunuch once said, "The world outside is large, but it forgets. The palace remembers." And that was enough. For men who had been erased, once being remembered by anyone, even a sultan, was a kind of rebirth. Sometimes visitors envied them. Envoys wrote home about the eunuchs' wealth-jeweled turbans, villas by the Bosporus servants of their own. They forgot to mention that every piece of gold had to be returned when its owner died. Even the servants belonged to the palace, not the man. When a eunuch's body was carried out, the locks of his house were changed before the burial incense cooled. Still, their influence extended beyond the walls. A favored eunuch might whisper to the valide sultan, who would whisper to the sultan, who would sign an order that moved armies. You can picture it, the entire empire trembling because of a conversation over tea between two people technically invisible. Yet the higher they rose, the lonelier it became. Friendships were calculated, laughter, cautious affection rationed. You wonder what they dreamed about when sleep came home, youth freedom. Maybe they dreamed of something smaller, walking through a gate without being watched. The palace cats seem to sense their melancholy. One rubs against your leg now, tail curling like a question mark. The eunuch feeding it smiles faintly. "She doesn't care who rules," he says. "That's why she's happy." Then he returns to polishing a gold bowl until it reflects nothing but light. Luxury can be louder than misery, and in this place the two are entwined. The eunuchs mastered that balance, knowing how to live richly in a cage, how to dress grief in silk. The palace rewarded their silence with opulence, and they accepted it because what else was left? You leave the chamber as the lamps dim. The air is sweet with musk and resignation. Behind you, laughter drifts from another room, low, deliberate, practiced. Even joy here knows its script. And as you pass the final archway, it hits you in a world where everyone fought for a place. At the table, the eunuchs learned to feast on the shadows instead. You can take away a man's body, but not his echo. That thought hits you as you step into a hall lined with marble plaques, each carved with the names of men who left no children, yet somehow outlived dynasties. The hook that catches your breath here isn't tragedy. It's defiance. They were never supposed to matter, and yet their fingerprints are still all over the empire's bones. The eunuch's paradox was simple. They had power without legacy. No sons to inherit, no daughters to pray for them, no family name to preserve. So they built their eternity in other ways. Through mosques, schools, fountains, endowments, even in the memories of the people they quietly elevated. You walk beneath domes they paid for, drink from fountains they funded, read histories they commissioned, proof that influence can reproduce itself even without blood. In Ottoman Istanbul, for instance, chief eunuchs like Bashir Aga became patrons of learning. He endowed a library near the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, filled with manuscripts that still exist today. Others built caravanserais for pilgrims' wells in deserts and shrines where travelers could rest. To them, faith wasn't a consolation, it was architecture. There's something both haunting and heroic in that. Imagine living your whole life inside borrowed walls, then deciding to leave something permanent in stone. They couldn't pass their blood forward, so they passed knowledge, mercy, and art instead. The same discipline that once guarded doors now guarded history. You pause by a small alcove where an older eunuch sits writing a will. He's not distributing wealth to children he has none, but to orphans' libraries, a mosque that will bear his name. If I can't plant a family tree, he murmurs, I'll plant shade for strangers. There's wisdom there, an understanding that immortality doesn't have to share your DNA, only your intention. Legacy took other forms too. Many eunuchs became mentors, raising promising servants, and scribes, teaching them languages, diplomacy manners. Some even adopted young protégés, unofficially boys, bought into service but lucky enough to be treated as something more than property. Through them, the eunuch's ways lived on their posture, their speech, their careful way of handling power as if it might explode. You might say, they built dynasties of influence, invisible lineages of loyalty and etiquette that rippled through centuries. Every great empire has its visible builders, the warriors, the kings, but also its custodians of memory. And here in these quiet halls, that's who they were. One inscription catches your eye, a marble panel engraved with flowing Ottoman script. It reads, "He guarded the gate of purity and opened the gate of wisdom." Beneath it, a name now forgotten by most, though once feared by viziers. You trace the grooves with your finger, thinking how strange it is that someone erased from manhood became immortal through marble. Even the architecture around you seems to echo their contradictions, strong, yet ornamental, austere, yet delicate. Much like them, necessary, disciplined, yet denied existence outside function. You imagine them supervising builders, adjusting columns, choosing verses for inscriptions, transforming what was taken from them into beauty that could outlast everyone who had taken it. There's a quiet pride in that kind of survival. Not the loud, heroic kind sung by poets, but the steady persistence of people who refuse to vanish. Their names might fade, but their choices shaped cities, economies, even faith itself. The pilgrimage roads to Mecca still pass by fountains they commissioned. Students still study by lamps they paid for. You wonder if they ever realized how permanent their shadows would become. Maybe not. Maybe it was enough to simply know that somewhere, someone was drinking clean water because of them. History often forgets faces, but remembers deeds, and the eunuchs understood that before anyone else. In the corner of the hall stands a statue, not of a ruler, but of a scribe holding a key. The inscription says only, "He kept what must be kept," and you can't help but smile. Because isn't that what they all did? They kept empires running, stories alive, and faith intact, all while being told they had no right to shape the world. And as you leave the hall, you glance back at those plaques glowing under oil lamps, realizing that legacy doesn't always need heirs. Sometimes it just needs witnesses. Faith, sin, and survival often sleep in the same bed. And in quiet corridors of the palace, you can feel them shifting beneath the same silk sheet. The eunuchs' lives weren't just built on obedience, they were built on theology too. To serve a sultan was one thing, but to serve God in a body rewritten by knives, that took an entirely different kind of courage. You sit beneath an arch where the evening call to prayer drifts through lattice shadows. The eunuchs kneel in rows, kebabs brushing the cool marble. Their chants sound softer, like the echo of a life halfway between two worlds. To them, prayer wasn't just duty, it was negotiation. They spoke to a creator who had allowed their bodies to be altered, asking quietly, "Am I still whole in your eyes?" Islamic law had long debated what to make of them. Some scholars called them impure, others saw them as victims of circumstance. In most palaces, they were granted a peculiar holiness, a kind of enforced purity that made them fit to guard the sacred. That's why many were sent to care for Mecca's great mosque to protect the Kaaba itself. Imagine that paradox, men who had been mutilated by empires now holding the keys to Islam's holiest site. And yet, faith wasn't just ritual, it was their oxygen. Stripped of family, they turned to God as the only relationship that couldn't be taken away. Some became poets, their verses aching with longing for divine perfection. Others collected hadiths, copying scripture by lamplight until dawn. They searched for meaning in every verse that spoke of trials and mercy. God tests those he loves, one of them might whisper while washing his hands before prayer. And we have been thoroughly examined. They redefined what manhood meant. Not by muscle or marriage, but by mastery of self, of silence, of loyalty. When others chased glory on battlefields, they pursued stillness, control, inner discipline. You can almost hear one chuckle. They think we've lost manhood, but we've just outsourced it to patience. It's tempting to see them only through tragedy, but that misses the resilience that faith gave them. In a world that saw them as half men, they became full believers. A chronicle from Medina describes a eunuch who led nightly prayers for pilgrims, his voice trembling yet powerful. He preached compassion, urging listeners to see beyond flesh. The knife cannot reach the soul, he said once, only the heart's silence can. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was reflection. They lived surrounded by lust and politics, yet they learned to exist without succumbing to either. Where others sinned in secret, the eunuchs turned abstinence into authority. People began to see them as holy intermediaries, closer to angels than men. And maybe that was the cruelest irony, to lose humanity and be rewarded with sanctity. Still, even faith couldn't quiet every question. Some nights alone in their chambers, they must have wondered what part of them God counted. Did prayer still rise from an incomplete body? Would paradise restore what life had taken? Those doubts were private, buried beneath ceremony, but they existed as surely as the heartbeat beneath the robe. Yet for every doubt there was devotion. Many eunuchs died in service to holy places, their tombs modest, often marked only by verses from the Quran. And God is the best of guardians. Their lives, once dictated by earthly masters, ended in surrender to something higher. In that surrender, they found a freedom the palace could never grant. You walk through the courtyard where they once performed ablutions. The fountain gurgles softly, its water cold and pure. Maybe that's why they loved the sound of water. It mirrored them, reshaped, redirected, yet still flowing. As you watch the ripples shimmer beneath the lanterns, a realization settles in. Faith wasn't their consolation, it was their rebellion. To believe after everything was an act of defiance. To serve a God who never abandoned them, even when men did, was the truest power of all. And when the last prayer of the day fades into silence, you swear you can still hear them voices, without bitterness, rising like wind through stone lattice, murmuring the one truth they never stopped repeating. We were remade by men, but remembered by God. Nothing in the palace lasts forever. Not the marble, not the dynasties, not even the silence. You wake one morning to find the corridors colder, the servants fewer, and the eunuch's footsteps fading like the last echo in a vast dome. The empire that built them is cracking. And when the walls crumble, so do the men who guarded them. The fall of the keeper begins quietly, without the drama of rebellions or flames. It begins with paperwork. One by one, their positions are dissolved. The harem downsizes, the royal treasury shrinks. Foreign ambassadors bring new ideas about progress and reform. The word modernization slithers through the palace like a draft. And modernization, as it turns out, has no use for shadows. You can almost see it, the chief eunuch, once the second most powerful man in the empire, sitting before a pile of documents he no longer understands. His seal has been replaced by a signature, his couriers by telegraphs. The letters that once carried life and death now gather dust in forgotten cabinets. The empire's heartbeat has moved elsewhere. When the Ottoman Sultanate fell in the early 20th century, the eunuch's world fell with it. The harems were disbanded, the palaces turned into museums or ministries. Men who had ruled from behind curtains suddenly found themselves in the open air, blinking against sunlight they hadn't seen in decades. Some couldn't bear it. They wandered the streets of Istanbul in their old uniforms, half mad with disorientation, bowing to passers-by who no longer recognized the gesture. One traveler's diary from 1925 describes an aged eunuch standing before the closed gates of Topkapi Palace, murmuring prayers to doors that would never open again. He had served 5 sultans, memorized their habits, buried their secrets, and now history had no more use for him. I was the keeper, he said softly, and now there is nothing to keep. It's hard not to feel something for them. Empires move on. People don't. When the music stops, the dancers keep swaying for a while, out of habit. The eunuchs were relics of an age that worshipped control and hierarchy. When that faith died, so did their purpose. But even in decline, they carried themselves with the same precision that had defined their lives. Many retired into religious service, caretakers of mosques, guides for pilgrims, teachers of etiquette. Their authority lingered in posture, in the measured way they spoke, in the respect they still commanded from those who knew. You can imagine one of them, now old and stooped, correcting a child's bow with a faint smile. Not like that. Grace is an inheritance too. Some adapted to modernity better than expected. They learned to read newspapers, to write letters, even to run small businesses. But no matter how they tried, the world saw them as curiosity symbols of a vanished order. Tourists whispered about them. Scholars romanticized them. Novelists turned them into metaphors.